Welcome to this week's rant, entitled A Trip to Tokyo 87. Although it's 86, but we'll come on to that in a minute. But before we get started, normal parish notices apply. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, why not? Hit the subscribe icon. If you want to be notified when content like this hits the channel, it's the bell icon for you. If you enjoy the content of this video, give it a big thumbs up. It really helps. Become a member of the TMTG community. The address is down there, as is the Patreon and Instagram feeds. That's where the notices of the channel are published. So go over there and tag me there. But now back to the video. But before we get into the main part of this week's video, Daniel Levy has left a comment on the channel regarding OASYS Sequences that I recently posted. And he thinks that his version of the instrument list, of the track primitive, has been mucked up. So for 10 seconds, over here will be the MIDI track listing and also the audio track listing. Now, I hope that you haven't got any audio tracks on your particular track listing, because if you have, that's wrong, because there are no audio tracks on this particular track. It's all MIDI and the instruments are listed over there. Now, I recently acquired two of these System Xclusive flyers. Now these were effectively, as far as I can tell, and somebody correct me please if I'm wrong, but these were sent out to the dealers, telling the dealers about Yamaha events and Yamaha instruments. Now I'm going to start with the first one, which was entitled X-Day Tokyo 97. These will pop up over here as I'm talking. And what's really interesting about this is it didn't actually happen in 87, it happened in November 86. But effectively what Yamaha did was they did the Yamaha musical equipment exhibition in Tokyo over these 2 days in November 86. And it was to showcase new instruments and Yamaha instruments that were in the market space. So what was the big thing that they showcased here? Well, 3.5 years before this, three and a half years, Yamaha had launched the DX7, game-changing synth, because of the fact it was a digital synth. And in November 86 and January 87, which is when this pamphlet was published, Roland had yet to publish or yet to launch the D-50. Okay, so Yamaha decided at this point they were going to revamp the DX7. They launched the DX7 MkII onto the market 3-4 months before the D50 hit the market in April 87. Yamaha came up with two new versions of the synth at this point in time, the two new versions being the Mark II D and the Mark II FD. As you guys know who watch the channel, I own a D. Desperate to get hold of an FD when a good one comes up. Unfortunately, recently I've seen a couple of good ones that were way over the top in terms of price, and I've seen a couple of ones that I just decided were going to be too much aggro to bring back to life. So I'm on the lookout for an FD. But that's effectively setting the scene for this Tokyo 87 or X-Day, Tokyo 87 in 86. So as I said, the exhibition itself was run over 2 days in 86, November 86, and it was the official launch of the DX7 Mark II. And I'm going to go over the DX7 Mark II because that is the subject of this one in a minute. But, you know, the key points where they were highlighting in here, the fact that it had 64 voices and 32 performances, which was above and beyond what was on the Mark I. And the DX7 at this particular event was demonstrated by two guys. Now, one of the guys was a guy called Gary Loonberger, who hails, as far as I can see, from the San Francisco area in America, and Dave Bristow, who is English and hails from Birmingham. And I can't do the Jeremy Clarkson Brummie accent, unfortunately. But for those who don't know who these two individuals were, Gary and Dave are quoted as part of the original FM programmers and hailed by Yamaha as synth legends, is the quotation from another publication. But both Gary and Dave programmed the stock tones on the Mark I and the Mark II, and most of the cartridges that came in between. So a lot of these cartridges that you and I may possess for the DX7 that changed the stock tones and been published by Yamaha, these two guys wrote most of those tones. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to a video, or sorry, not a video, it's a SoundCloud file on below here. It's an interview with Gary Loonberger. It's very amusing. It's about 40 minutes long, so be prepared. It's not sort of something you can just sort of listen to in your coffee break. But they were there demonstrating the DX7 Mark II. They also used the show, and there's the DX7 Mark II, to launch this thing. This thing was the R5 digital programmer, the UNI, a drum machine. And again, it was an FM-based drum machine. And did Gary and Dave program the sounds on that? It doesn't say so, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. Another piece of it, another area they were pushing during this show, on the other side here. So most of that is effectively related to the DX7 and the R5, RX5. Then we move over here. Nice picture of the DX7 at the top there, and they start promoting the PCM1 percussion MIDI converter, so the whole sort of Yamaha digital percussion system. Why were they doing that? Well, because they were trying to promote their tone modules, because tone modules became the big thing. Not only did you have a keyboard, but you had loads of tone modules. And funny enough, look at that. There, on the next page, is a TX81Z, or Z, if you live in my part of the world, which was effectively the a stripped-down version of a DX7 in a 1U module. Now, the TX781Z, I've got one of those. A lot of people have got the TX81Z, I'm saying that. And the reason why, funky bass lines off this thing. It was used a lot by producers for its bassline capability. So we move on from there, and then they move on to the DMP7 digital mixing desk. Again, why was that such a big thing in 1986-87? It was probably one of the first affordable, I say affordable, it wasn't particularly cheap, but affordable digital mixing consoles. It was only an 18 stereo out mixer, but it does everything from the input, DNA conversion, to the output, A to D conversion, digitally. And it was one of the first few mixers that hit a price point that a semi-pro musician probably could actually afford it. So that was the exhibition. And then if we look at the back of this, you can see there is Gary and Dave demonstrating the DX7s. They've both got a DX7 Mark II in front of them. Then we move on to the DX7. Now this one is a month after this, so that was January 87. This is February 87. The DX7 has officially been launched by this point in time. And why was the DX7 such a ground changer? Well, I said that before. It moved synthesis from an analog generation where you had oscillators and waveforms to something that was being generated by a digital algorithm. This thing was completely digital. And the DX7 Mark II improved on the Mark I. The Mark I had flaws. This improved on it. Yamaha looked at all the problems with the Mark I and improved them. That's the only way I can put it. So this thing, out of the box, was MIDI version 1 compliant. Where the MIDI on the Mark I was MIDI. You could play it via MIDI, but you were very limited in what you could do. The Mark I or the 1.0 standard for MIDI hadn't been ratified by all the manufacturers, so the synthesizers that were built around about sort of 82, 83, or designed in that sort of area, kind of knew what the standard was going to look like, so they built a version of Midi. But it wasn't until a couple of years later they actually ratified the standard as 1.0, and this was then 1.0 compliant. It introduced the concept of split and dual mode, so you could have two tones on the keyboard, which was something over and above what you could do with the Mark I. And it also introduced a new memory cartridge for the Mark II, which was the RAM 4, that had 4 times the capacity of the RAM 1 cartridge. Better user interface came with this, so you can see that on there, that it had a better, it's better on there actually. There you go, there's the user interface. It was a 2-line high 40 character interface. Far better than the Mark I. And over here, you see you had those two sort of LED number display things that told you what tones you had on which layer, which part of the keyboard. Brilliant. It came up with features like micro-tuning and fractional level scaling. The first was sort of allowing you to vary the pitch of the across the entire instrument. The second allowed you to vary individual keys. Sorry, the first one was pitch on individual keys. The second one was allowed the operator of every 3 keys to be controlled. Honestly, I've never fully understood them and I never fully used them. Random pitch is quite an interesting feature. I've used that. It's available on lots of modern keyboards nowadays. But it allows you to sort of effectively say that if you hit a key, it will vary the pitch plus or minus X% or X tones or X steps or whatever it happens to be. Gives you quite a nice wide sound. Very reminiscent of sort of the early analog synths, where depending on whether it was raining, whether people were smoking, whether you were drinking, varied the pitch of the keys across the keyboard independently of what you wanted it to do. So that was kind of being able to do the same thing, but actually you could control it. Then there was something called Unison Mode, again something very, very useful. Allows you to trigger 4 keys at the point of hitting 1 key, so you could play effectively 4 keys, and then you could effectively randomly, or you could vary the tuning of each one of those keys that was being played, and you get a nice fat wide sound rather than just a single spot on tone. There was also independent output panning, multi-mode LFO, and pitch EG. I very rarely use them, so I'm not going to really talk about them. One feature that was really good was the fact that you could actually assign different things to the faders. You had 2 independent faders on the DX7 MkII. Something that Roland mimicked and a lot of other manufacturers mimicked around the same time. The D-50, if I remember correctly, and I'm not looking at my D-50 because it's not here. But the D-50 has 2 data input sliders the same as this. Whether they pinched it off each other, I don't know, but as one came out after the other, it's possible. And then the best feature ever that came into the Mark II was the 3.5-inch floppy drive. And people always say that, well, you can put it on cartridge, you can do SysX. Believe me, backing up things to cartridge or floppy drive is far easier than faffing with SysX. And having a floppy drive on this thing was a godsend to the musician, because he could put his patches on a floppy and travel, get to the other end, load them into the DX7, and away he goes. Now, you know, it's kind of been mirrored over the years with sort of USB and being able to put stuff on USB keys, but you kind of get stuck with some of these machines, especially the Kronos. I mean, the Kronos is a really cracking example of this gone wrong or gone right, in that if you construct a set of patches with a set of tones that have been loaded onto your Kronos, because it's a unique key, you can't load those patches onto somebody else's Kronos unless they've got the same patch packs on their machine licensed to that machine. But this allowed people to do that, and that was a godsend. So there you go. That was 2 System Xclusive flyers from 1987. Remember, guys and girls, if you managed to get this far and you enjoyed this video, give it the thumbs up. It only helps the channel. Other than that, I'll see you next time round. Live long and prosper.